Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Better Call Saul Season 4. In this video, I'll give my full-length review of Season 4 of Better Call Saul as a whole. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for Better Call Saul up to the end of Season 4. If you haven't seen all of Season 4 of Better Call Saul, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you. So it seems like every season with Better Call Saul, I'm saying that this is the best season of the show yet. And at the risk of sounding repetitive, Season 4 is the best season of the show yet. And I think there's a reason why I keep saying this. It's similar to Breaking Bad. I do think Better Call Saul does get better with each season. There has been things I loved about each season since Season 1, and while every season had that same slow pace that's become a signature of the show, I would say this is the best paced season. It's not any faster, because it isn't. It's just because I would describe this pace as a steady pace. And what I mean by that is that every season tends to dip in the middle of the season with episodes or scenes which I would describe as filler, that are either unnecessary or altogether drag out a bit too long or longer than necessary. And as much as I absolutely love the style of the show, which is one of the things that makes this show so great, sometimes the show can get a bit too wrapped up in the cinematic style rather than the aspect of telling a story. And I think this happened a lot in Season 3, for example, but Season 3 made up for this by having extreme high points that remained some of the best moments of the entire show. And while Season 4's high points weren't quite as high as that in Season 3, it is overall more consistently good and a better paced season, as I would say it's the first season to not really have any of this filler or dragged out stylistic scenes that drag on longer than necessary and interfere with the story being told. So although Season 4 moves with the same slow pace every season does, it's more purposeful, and every scene builds off one another, and it's vital to storytelling of the show. So that is why I would say Season 4 is the best season of the show so far. So let's get into some of the characters of the show, and let's start with Jimmy McGill's storyline, which of course is the heart of the show. Now, it's interesting, when I first started watching the show, I didn't realize how long it would take to get to the point that it does at the end of this season, and I was expecting the show to get there by like the end of Season 1 or even sometime in Season 2, but I have to say, seeing how they did it this way, I see how it works so much better to slowly build to the moment where Jimmy McGill becomes Saul Goodman. And the journey was absolutely brilliant storytelling and an amazing character study. Very similar to what they did with Walter White in Breaking Bad, but very different as well. I remember when the spin-off series was first announced, many questioned if a side character like the sleazy lawyer Saul Goodman, who was just like a one-beat side character in Breaking Bad, would be able to carry a show. But seeing the full story of his background and how he got to be that sleazy lawyer was so fascinating, such a great dynamic character study. It's now hard to imagine how anyone could ever even question that he could carry a show, as this has been such a groundbreaking character story, even completely if you just disregard Breaking Bad and judge the show just on its own merits. In fact, you don't even need to have seen Breaking Bad to appreciate how good this show is. And what's different about Season 4 is this is the first season to not feature Michael McKean as Jimmy's older brother Chuck, who has always been a staple of the show and was particularly powerful in the previous season. And I can see how some might question how the show could be as good without him, and some might question what the point of having Chuck in the show was in the first place if he just died before Jimmy's big transformation. However, even though Chuck wasn't in the season per se, his presence was very much felt throughout the season, even when he wasn't directly mentioned. The subtext of how his death affected the characters was always there. Therefore, it's clear he was vital to the overall story being told and instrumental in Jimmy's transformation. As throughout the season, Jimmy seemed to be avoiding his brother's death at all times. He never acted as though he was directly affected by it, and in fact went out of his way to not mention his brother. And while many like Kim felt that this was because he was so affected by his brother's death that he refused to face it, the ending of the season drops the bomb that is more because his brother personified for him everyone that tried to keep him down and prevent him from succeeding, everyone that didn't believe in him. And that's why it was so vital to get Chuck's story in the first 3 seasons, and what we see in this season is really the conclusion to that. At the season's end, with Jimmy trying to get his law license back and is being blocked from doing so because during the interview he goes out of his way to not mention his brother, and his brother was involved in how he lost his license in the first place and has since passed away. So many thought to not mention him was insincere. And when this was brought to his attention, he went out of his way to honor Chuck, and at a hearing made his entire statement about Chuck. And while Kim thought this would be healing for Jimmy and get him to acknowledge the feelings that he's been hiding from about how sad he is over his brother's death, but instead of that, Jimmy reveals it's all just an act, which proved that Jimmy actually wasn't all that broken up by his brother's death after all, and that his actions in the previous season about Chuck thinking that Jimmy was no good and would never amount to anything had permanently damaged Jimmy's opinion of Chuck, and no longer did Jimmy think of his brother as a beloved brother, but rather an impediment who never believed in him. Another aspect that made Season 4 unique is that Jimmy had lost his law license at the end of Season 3, so this would be the first season where Jimmy would not be a lawyer for the entirety of the season. And to be honest, this actually worried me at first, because I thought it would be a bit tedious to just see Jimmy moping around without his law license, but it actually turned out to be really interesting and absolutely vital to the story of Jimmy's transformation into Saul Goodman. In fact, while the first three seasons built the groundwork for who Jimmy McGill is as a person and his backstory, the character of Jimmy McGill is still really different than the character of Saul Goodman in Breaking Bad, as Jimmy is a much nicer person and has a pure relationship with Kim and a lot of pure feelings, and even at the start of the show had a pure relationship with his brother. And Saul Goodman isn't shown having that kind of relationship with anyone. So Season 4 does a lot to move that transition along and show how the character of Jimmy we know and love from the first 3 seasons could become the sleazy scumbag Saul that we saw in Breaking Bad. And I think it's a vital step in that story that was absolutely fascinating to see. So Jimmy not being a lawyer this season is important for several reasons. For one, it strengthens his desire to become a lawyer. As the old saying goes, it's human nature to want what you don't have. Also, it enforces to Jimmy his mindset of the world trying to keep him down and prevent him from succeeding, which is also very motivating for him. Also, this season does a lot to develop the aspect of how Saul Goodman is connected to the criminal underworld and seems to have a lot of criminal ties, something that wasn't really developed in the previous seasons. How we see Jimmy searching for another job, and at first he seems to sabotage himself and not actually be interested in getting a job because nothing satisfies him, but he ends up taking a job as a cell phone salesman, mainly just to appease Kim to show her that he's okay. But of course he's incredibly bored in that role, and so as always he has a need for mischief, and it gets the better of him, so he ends up making a business selling untraceable cell phones to the more criminal elements who would need untraceable disposable phones for their illegal dealings. And in doing so, Jimmy makes a lot of connections, and because he's friendly with a lot of the criminal underworld, so in addition, when selling these phones, to not sully his name, he uses the alias that he used before, Saul Goodman, and thus he becomes known to these criminal elements as Saul Goodman. And this season does a good job of showing Jimmy's development in this world, as at first it was a rough transition as he gets jumped by a group of young thugs, and he realizes that things aren't the same as they were back when he was slipping Jimmy, and also that he's not the same. So he uses his resources and wits to get back at them and thus ensure that people will know not to mess with him in the future. Also, he shows that he has absolutely no compunction in skirting the law and helping drug dealers and thieves and other types of criminals do their crimes as long as it benefits him, which is precisely the type of person that he will become in Breaking Bad. Also, earlier in the season, he was shown running a heist with connections and breaking the entry, further establishing all the connections that he will have in Breaking Bad. And of course, we see him hiring Huel as his bodyguard, something that was a cool aspect of Breaking Bad. And we also see him running a scam in order to prevent Huel from going to prison, which also explains why Huel is so devoted to him, because Saul has proven himself useful and helpful. And so we see his journey this season of caring less about what is legal and right, because that's something Chuck cared about. And that part of him that cared about these things too was the part trying to impress Chuck, or to be like Chuck. But that part of him is now dead, and now he wants nothing to do with Chuck, and instead his main motivation is to show everyone who tried to keep him down like Chuck that he can succeed, that he is a winner. Which to me is personified in one of my favorite scenes of the entire show, in the season finale, where Jimmy gives a speech to a young high school student applying for a scholarship that Jimmy knows she will never get because she's shoplifted once. And so Jimmy sees that everyone on the scholarship board will always just see her as nothing more than a shoplifter. And so he personally identifies with her a lot, as he feels he was treated the same way, particularly with Chuck saying that he'll always be slipping Jimmy and will never amount to anything. So the speech he gives to her really makes it clear how he sees himself, and shows his true motivations in becoming a lawyer is to do whatever it takes to succeed and to prove all of those who doubted him just how wrong they were. Also, I do wonder if we will see the character of the teen in the future, as I could see that Jimmy's speech to her had a huge impact on her, as we know that the show will jump into the future, because it has from time to time with the post-Breaking Bad timeline with Gene, so I think it's possible we may see her as an adult. Well, perhaps not, but I think it would be cool. Anyway, let me talk about Kim now. As she had a great season as well. In fact, I would say this is probably the best season for Kim. And Ray Seahorn as an actor, and I think her performance here that she gives this season is absolutely brilliant. That is an upside to not having Chuck in the season, that we get to focus more on Kim and her relationship with Jimmy, which was just fascinating to see. So Kim, unlike Jimmy, was affected by Chuck's death, as she felt a lot of guilt in her involvement in discrediting him, which led to what was very clearly a suicide. This was most personified in the amazing scene where she yelled at Howard for unburdening himself about the guilt he felt over Chuck's death. She claimed to be upset on Jimmy's behalf, but it was very clear that Jimmy actually wasn't bothered by this, and in fact was a bit relieved that Howard was taking some of the blame and the burden and not putting it on him. But it clearly bothered Kim, who did see Chuck as a hero and is trying to run from the guilt that she feels. And it was fascinating to watch Kim and Jimmy's relationship devolve this season. It's very clearly an unhealthy relationship. It was built up very nicely into a full-blown romance for the first 3 seasons, but here we see that it slowly is beginning to fall apart, as Chuck's death has affected them for sure, and Jimmy's apparent indifference to it and how they never talk about it really builds a rift between them. And so the relationship becomes superficial, where they never talk about anything of real importance or how they actually feel. Plus, they drift apart professionally, as Kim becomes a more successful banking lawyer and Jimmy goes deeper into the criminal underworld. But Kim goes through an interesting character journey as well, as she becomes bored and less interested in her job as a banking lawyer. However, driven by guilt over her part in Chuck's downfall, instead of Jimmy, she actually strives to do good in the world, as she becomes obsessed with becoming a public defender to help those less fortunate. In fact, she becomes so wrapped up in this that this nearly threatens her position as Mercer Verde's attorney. And so she finds a way to continue as a banking lawyer, but devote most of her time to her passion, which is defending those less fortunate. She does this by joining the firm Schweitzer and Copley, established in the earlier seasons, so that she has a team that can handle most of Mercer Verde's needs while she's off being a public defender. And it's interesting contrasting the work that she's doing here with what Saul Goodman will eventually do. As when she tells Jimmy about how good it feels to be a criminal lawyer, he talks about wanting to become a criminal lawyer for the same reasons, to help people. But we know that there's a major difference from what Kim does to what Saul ends up doing, as Kim genuinely tries to look out for those in tough situations who maybe made bad choices and helps them put their lives back on track. Whereas Saul Goodman will enable criminals to continue their criminal behavior and in fact encourages them to do so as he profits off their continued criminal activity. In fact, arguably, it's not just what he will do, it's what he's doing now with selling untraceable cell phones to criminals, allowing them to conduct their illegal activity more effectively. Now, Kim and Jimmy's relationship takes an interesting turn towards the end of the season, where after it's clear that their relationship is dying and most likely things will just end up being the most unlikely of things, ends up revitalizing their relationship. After Huell gets arrested and threatened with jail time, he insists he will not serve as he threatens to make a run for it. Jimmy asks for Kim's help. And she at first, I think, just thinks of it as another case, or just a favor for Jimmy, until she speaks to the prosecutor and finds that the prosecutor is being completely unreasonable and giving Huell what she deems as unfair treatment, and so it becomes personal for her. And so she gets involved with Jimmy in a scheme to get Huell off of the charges. In fact, the scheme is all her idea, to set up a fake campaign from Huell's hometown in Louisiana to make it seem like he has tons of supporters outraged by his arrest, a scheme that Jimmy pulls off expertly. So the public pressure forces the DA to capitulate and make a deal that doesn't involve Huell going to jail. Now, the interesting turn is that running the scheme endures Kim to Jimmy even more, as doing so really excites her and brings her closer to him. However, I still contend it's an unhealthy relationship, and although Kim originally got involved in a scheme that's clearly illegal because she felt she was doing the right thing and she genuinely believed Huell was being treated unfairly, she got caught up in the excitement of running a scam. So ends up doing it again, this time so she can simply give her banking client a bigger bank, which is clearly not a charity case, and in so doing so, she's doing it just for the thrill this time. But when Jimmy tries to point this out to her, she denies it and doesn't like the fact that he is pointing out this hard truth to her, that she's actually enjoying the thrill of the scam rather than doing it because it's the right thing to do. So after it looks like Jimmy will be denied the reinstatement of his law license, she and Jimmy finally have it out in an amazing scene that was really well earned, as it was built up to all season, where it's made clear why Jimmy is so upset that Kim doesn't want to become his partner, because he sees it as a sign that she thinks that he's no good, that she's just like Chuck and is one of the people who don't believe in him and wants to keep him down. This is of course unfair, and Kim points out that she's done a lot to help him and hits him with a whopper that he's always down, which is true, as he always seems to put himself in a rough spot, which apparently finally destroys the relationship. However, Kim then goes to Jimmy and offers to help him get his law license back, and that's by running a scam of how much he loves his brother Chuck. However, I believe that Kim thought that Jimmy actually did love his brother and was just, bringing that to the surface. But when it's revealed that Jimmy thought the whole thing as a scam and thought that the board members were suckers for believing him, this really hits her, as this means she was also a sucker, as she also believed that Jimmy's words about Chuck were sincere, but turns out that he doesn't care at all about his brother. And this fact obviously impacts Kim greatly. And it's interesting how oblivious that Jimmy was to Kim's obvious shock and disgust of what Jimmy's revealing. So it's going to be fascinating, absolutely fascinating to see how Kim and Jimmy's relationship devolves from here. Whatever happens is not going to be good, as they are clearly going in separate directions, but I do think that something may happen between them that pushes Jimmy even more to becoming the Saul Goodman that we know from Breaking Bad. So next, let's get into Mike's storyline. Now, earlier in the season, in the earlier seasons, I kind of complained about how Mike's storyline really rarely intercepted Saul's storyline. It seemed kind of superfluous. And this season, that could be true of Mike's storyline, Nacho's storyline, and Gus's storyline, which were all intertwined with each other, but had absolutely nothing to do with Jimmy and Kim's storyline. But I'm actually okay with that now, as I just grown to accept that these characters are staples of the show, and I just trust that their storylines were intertwined sometime eventually. In fact, the only time we see Mike and Jimmy together this season is when Jimmy offers Mike a part in a scheme to steal the figurine, in which Mike declines. Although this makes sense for how we see Mike and Saul's relationship in Breaking Bad. As Mike is still in contact of Saul, Saul just thinks of him as his PI and has no idea about Mike's connection with Gus Fring. So this is all consistent, and in fact goes further to explain how Saul can know Mike but not know that he's involved with Gus. And Mike's storyline this season is much like Jimmy's in that it goes a long way to show how he will become the character we know from Breaking Bad. As far as Mike goes, that concerns more of how Mike will become Gus's right-hand man, and also how ruthless Mike will become, and that he's willing to kill, in contrast to what we saw of him in Season 2, where he went out of his way not to kill. So Mike starts out resuming his quiet life with his daughter-in-law and his granddaughter, living off the money that he stole from the Salamancas that Gus is laundering for him. But, you see, much like Jimmy, Mike is not content to live the quiet life, and he needs to be doing things. So Mike inserts himself into the fictional role as a security consultant that Gus had given him in order to launder money to him, and makes that role real. He says he does it to legitimize this role, which will lessen the risk in case anyone asks any questions, which is true. But I do believe there is more to it than that he needed to feel useful. Lydia is not on board with this, thus is setting up for these two characters to not like each other, which they don't in Breaking Bad. But Gus doesn't have a problem with it, in part because I think he is impressed by Mike and has an inkling that Mike could be useful to him. So Mike continues to go to this grief group therapy sessions with his daughter-in-law over the loss of his son, and he had started to make friends with some people there, including a woman where it looked like there might be a romance blooming. However, he really decides that none of this is for him when he sees that his daughter-in-law is doing, all she is doing is wallowing in self-pity, and this is made worse by the fact that a member of the group is lying and hadn't lost anyone at all and is just feeding off of other people's grief. He, of course, points all this out, which alienates him from the group and I think ends the prospect of that budding romance. But he does eventually mend things with his daughter-in-law, but they won't be as close as they once were. But more than that, I think this reaffirms to Mike that he needs to stop wallowing in self-pity and needs to be more active. So when Gus approaches him about a job, Mike is more than willing to take it. In fact, Gus tries to trick and intimidate Mike into taking the job, but Mike sees through it and points out that it isn't necessary because he wants to take it. This, I think, only impresses Gus even more. So the job, we discover, is helping in the construction of the underground super lab that we saw in Breaking Bad. In one sense, I think it's kind of unnecessary to actually see the construction of this lab, but in another sense, it does make it make a bit more sense and why it's there. And we get another Breaking Bad cameo with Gale, whom the lab is originally intended for, which again also makes a lot of sense. So Mike isn't, of course, going to construct the lab himself, but is in charge of security and keeping the construction secret, which, as we see, he's really good at, and I think Gus is impressed with him. So they hire a group of Germans to do the construction, led by an old engineer named Werner, who becomes friends with Mike. During the construction, we're introduced to a rambunctious troublemaker named Kai that they present as someone who's going to cause issues, but that turns out to be a red herring, as in fact Werner is the one who becomes an issue. As when they're out at the bar, while Kai gets into trouble by harassing a stripper, that's an easy problem for Mike to solve, as he just pays off the right people. What becomes more of an issue is Werner blabbing to some locals where he gives away too much information. This is a problem, but Mike vouches for Werner with Gus and reassures him that it won't happen again. Also, he tries to warn Werner about how serious a threat that Gus is, but I don't think Werner completely understands. Because later it becomes clear Werner's losing it, and he asks Mike to leave for a weekend so he can visit his wife, and Mike says no, so he tricks the security cameras and escapes. Where he arranges to have his wife visit him in a nearby resort. But Mike tracks him down and brings him in, and Gus orders that he be killed. Mike tries to talk him out of it, but when he realizes that he will be unable to do so, Mike kills Werner himself, the man who has become his friend. And man, was that a powerful scene. But again, I think this does a lot to show the journey of Mike becoming the man he is in Breaking Bad. For one, Gus now knows he can fully count on him, and that he's able to track down the man who escaped, and he makes up for his own mistake. Also, that he's willing to follow orders that he doesn't want to. And after Mike had killed the man he thought of as his friend, this hardens Mike to kill him. So it makes sense he will be more willing and able to kill in the future, which again sets up his character for Breaking Bad. As far as the thread left hanging for next season, it's mostly to do with the super lab that isn't finished yet, and it is still a hole in the ground. So it's interesting to see how this will be completed. And Mike still isn't Gus's right-hand man, so that's also something that will have to happen to endear Mike more to Gus. So speaking of Gus, let me touch on him now, as this season builds more on him making himself more independent from the cartel and setting up his own drug business. As we saw the conclusion of this conflict in Breaking Bad, where the cartel fought against him as he garnered too much power and independence. But here we see the origins of that, where the cartel is still ignorant about Gus's grabbing power because he's being really slick about it. As he kills one of the Salamanca gangsters and then stages it to look like a rival gang did it, so the Salamancas will wipe out that rival gang so he can come in and take over their territory. And of course the construction of the super lab and his business relations with Gale are there so he can manufacture his own drugs to further establish independence from the cartel, whom we know from Breaking Bad that he has a grudge against. And he has a grudge against Hector Salamanca in particular, and that grudge is also explored more as he refuses to let Hector die because he wants him to live and suffer. So he hires doctors to assess his condition, and when the doctor tells him that Hector would need expert care only offered in places like Johns Hopkins, he manages to get a doctor from Johns Hopkins to come and take charge of Hector's care through, legitimate donations, of course. And the doctor is clearly top-notch quality doctor in her field, and she does manage to save Hector's life. And once it's clear to Gus that Hector is stable and that Hector is still him, Gus dismisses the doctor, even though she insists that she could get him walking and talking again, but that's not what Gus wants. Gus wants Hector to suffer. So the thought of him living the rest of his life paralyzed, only able to communicate through moving his finger, is very appealing to Gus. Of course, those of us who saw Breaking Bad know that this is the state that Hector will be in that show, so this is the state we've been waiting for. But it's really interesting to see that Gus had a role in putting him in that state. And now, finally, let me move over to Nacho. Nacho has always been an interesting character who's appeared more in some seasons than others, and he probably appeared more in the first half of this season, as we see that if carries on from season 3, where he had poisoned Hector to protect his father, and he succeeds, but he fails to get himself out of the business. And it's made clear that he doesn't want to be involved with the cartel anymore, but there's nothing he can do about it. In fact, things get worse for him when Gus kills his fellow goon and makes it clear that he knows that he poisoned Hector and could expose him to the Salamancas, which would mean an instant death for him and probably his family as well. So Gus now owns him, as he puts it, meaning it is impossible for him to leave the life because Gus would never allow it, because Gus wants to have his inside man inside the Salamanca's operation. And this comes off in a very powerful scene we get after Nacho was shut up by Gus's men in order to stage the heist, where he's bleeding and suffering in his father's home, and it's clear that he's trapped and he doesn't want this life anymore, but there's nothing he can do about it. We later see that Nacho does indeed end up running the Salamanca's operations, as we see him playing the same role that Hector used to play, and he is just as ruthless as Hector was, and he leads the life of a playboy with like women, luxuries, and basically living the high life. But then we see him in private that this isn't actually at all the life he wants, and he still yearns for something simple, for a simple life with his father, and the tough gangster act is just that, an act. And that is an absolutely fascinating character story. However, the story gets even more complicated with the introduction of Lalo, a Salamanca, Hector's nephew, I believe, who asserts himself into Nacho's operation, effectively taking it over. And Lalo's a very interesting character because unlike the other Salamancas we see in the show like Hector or Tuco or the twins, Lalo is not openly hostile or intimidating, but instead he puts on a facade of being overly friendly and hospitable. But as we see, that's all just an act done in order to disarm people or to catch them off guard, as he is in fact just as ruthless and just as dangerous as the other Salamancas. And at the moment, Nacho has to just follow his lead. And it's clear that Lalo is onto the fact that Gus is up to no good, as he has Gus under surveillance and eventually learns of the issue that Gus had with Werner. Now, what's interesting to think about for those who have seen Breaking Bad is the very first episode Saul was introduced, there was a scene where Walt and Jesse take Saul to the desert and threaten to kill him as a way to entice him to do what they want. But Saul assumes that they're with the cartel and he starts speaking Spanish. He said, "It wasn't me, it was Ignacio," and when Jesse makes it clear that he doesn't know what he's talking about, he says, "What, Lalo didn't send you?" So that has very interesting implications for the next season, as Ignacio refers to Nacho, and Lalo, of course, we met this season. So it implies that Jimmy will somehow come involved with Nacho in something that Lalo would want to kill him over if he ever found out about it. And also it shows us we are fast approaching Breaking Bad times, and this Lalo character is in fact very fascinating, so it'll be very interesting to see what happens with Lalo, Nacho, and Gus, and how Saul Goodman will become involved. So I absolutely cannot wait for next season. So my rating for Better Call Saul Season 4 out of 10 is a 9 excellent. An absolutely superb season of television. I'm giving it a 9 instead of a 10 because it wasn't quite as groundbreaking as I'd hoped it would be, but that's not a knock on the season at all, because 10, actually, I reserve my 10s for really truly great shows. 9 is still a very high rating, and it was an absolutely superb and excellent storytelling this season. As I said, it had a good, strong, steady pace and wasn't as bogged down in filler as the previous seasons were. We have some great character development with Jimmy, Kim, Mike, Nacho, and all the main characters. We get some amazing scenes such as Jimmy's speech to the high school student, Kim yelling at Howard, and the crushing scene of Mike having to kill a friend. So excellent storytelling, excellent year of television. So that's it for my review of Better Call Saul Season 4, and I will return next year to cover Season 5, which I cannot wait for. In the meantime, you can check out my channel as I do videos on many other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Lost, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.